And we are recording. Ian Bremmer, welcome to the Mehlman Castagnetti Rosen Thomas Zoom Leadership Series. There is more interest in hearing from you today on geopolitical risk than people we've had who are experts, military war heroes. We've had experts in the elections. We've had experts in pandemic diseases. You are Bruce Springsteen when it comes to Zooms about geopolitics. So you got that going for you.
Thank you. And I also, Melly asked me to promise to wear pants during this Zoom this morning. I told him I charged more otherwise. So I think we're all aligned, I think, for the purposes of this call.
Too soon. So first and foremost, how are you and your team managing? You're putting out unbelievably great stuff. Obviously, you're a knowledge-based business, so it feels like people's ability to work from home or to work remotely shouldn't be that impaired. But how are you doing? How's the team doing?
Well, I mean, as you know, it's a K-shaped recovery, and the people on this line are experiencing the right side of that K. And so in that regard, you feel blessed, you feel appreciative, you feel glad that you're able to continue to make a good living for the couple hundred folks that we have. And you feel like you have purpose because helping people navigate this global environment is something that feels particularly relevant to do right now. On the other hand, I'll tell you, we've hired about 35 people, new people, some replacements, some new people since March. So in a firm of about 200 people, there are 35 people that we have not met physically. And, in a firm of human capital where culture matters that much, where, trying to get these people integrated, I feel like we're eating seed corn right now. I mean, if you tell me that we have another 6 months where we still can't engage as human beings, you're going to have an awful lot of folks that feel kind of rogue. And I'm not enormously comfortable with that. I mean, we're finding ways to get people together outside in small groups. Our offices are open. Maybe 10 or 15% of the people are coming in occasionally. But it is not, I mean, you're certainly not getting the level of serendipitous human creativity that comes from having all of these brilliant people together. And I would say personally, I don't mind not getting on planes. It's not something I never enjoyed, but it's interesting. You and I know each other. I think about the way I've engaged with people in the last 7-8 months, and there are about 100 people out there that I consider really important to my business that I've gotten to know a lot better. I've spent a lot more time personally with, and some of them are some of our CEO clients, some of them, Antonio Gutierrez at the UN or Kristalina Georgiev at the IMF, because I mean, usually we'd see each other at Davos or at UNGA or at Munich Security Conference, but that was it. And in between, we might email each other. Now, no one's going anywhere, so we're forcing each other to Zoom more. That's been awesome. On the other hand, I would guess that in the last 8 months, any other year, I probably would have met in person another 1,000 people, of whom a couple hundred would probably be relevant to something, content, business, partnership, you name it, media, who knows? And I bet that number is more like 100 in the last 8 months. And so it's just different, right? I mean, and we can all adapt, but God forbid this became the new normal. I think it would be deeply problematic for a lot of folks in our fields.
I think that's right. And I share your, I'm more productive, but there's less unexpected serendipity. There's less brainstorming. There are fewer opportunities for unplanned positive things. And I feel like my life is a succession of unplanned positive things. But before we dive into lots of global challenges, you and I have been emailing earlier, and I want to start on a note of optimism. I had asked you what's going right in the world, particularly as I look at COVAX. I mean, obviously the U.S. isn't part of it. That's a big gap. At the same time, in a world of trade wars and paranoia, it's nice to see so many nations planning to try to collaborate on something of this scale. What do you think of that? And what else do you look at right now and say that gives me hope that there is a positive upside global future?
The fact that the largest economy in the world isn't participating, the Chinese dragged their feet. And even once they joined, they're talking about, I think, 1% of their spend domestically on vaccines is planning to go towards COVAX. I mean, the participation is kind of marginal. Russia's not a part of it. I'm not sure that COVAX gives me optimism. Vaccine nationalism is more what we're seeing, but there are some things that give me optimism. Maybe the most significant one is the fact that the Europeans are using this crisis to redistribute wealth from the north and west to the south and east, particularly the south. And Euroscepticism is a lot weaker. I mean, I was talking to Kyriakos Mitsotakis, the Greek prime minister, who's a lovely guy and a pretty good friend, a few days ago. And a lot of you on the phone probably know a bit about him. He was a Harvard economist, so he's very well aligned to the West and to markets. And he's talking about the money that they're going to be getting as grants, as relief from the EU. It represents a Marshall Plan for Greece. And not only has that significantly reduced Euroscepticism in his own country, a country that has suffered economically more than any other country in Europe over the last 10 plus years, but also it gives them a real leg up strategically if they spend that money wisely on human capital and related infrastructure that will provide returns over the long term. And I think that's true in Spain, it's true in Italy, it's true in many of these countries. The fact that Angela Merkel, who had been, basically at the end of her tether, how unpopular she was for offering 1 million Syrian refugees to come into her country. She's now seen clearly as not just the leader in Germany, but the leader of Europe. And it's the largest economy in Europe. I think that's a big positive deal. So that's one very significant positive thing that I would talk about. A second would be the ability and willingness of many, the Europeans also kind of leading the way, but the Chinese doing more than expected on climate. The announcements I've seen on how much of that relief and money spent over the coming years from the EU will be spent on green and sustainability, how much of that is going to be spent on China on green and sustainability, their willingness by 2060 to go carbon negative as a country. They're still exporting a lot of coal and coal infrastructure to other countries. So it's not as if they're suddenly a model, an exemplar, but it's far more than you would have expected without the pandemic. And finally, here in Japan, you've got a move away from probably the strongest leader that we had in the G7 in the last couple of years, Shinzo Abe. And it's an incredibly smooth transition with a popular figure that has been hand-selected by the outgoing prime minister. And I think that you're going to see stability and a comfortable transition in Japan, which is, the third largest economy in the world. So, if you're in the United States right now with 2 weeks before the election and the insanity of our political system, it doesn't feel good. But if you just widen the aperture a little bit and see how the world has been responding, I think it's more mixed. I think the lessons are more mixed. We, unfortunately, are largely failing on our ability to respond as a nation, our ability to rally around the flag. Remember, George W. had, I think, 92% approval ratings after 9/11, and President Trump's approval ratings right now are exactly what they were before the pandemic. And the hostility and the antipathy and the polarization in the United States has, if anything, intensified over the last 7-8 months. So it's just hard to internalize those bits of structural optimism when you're sitting in particular the Acela corridor in the United States.
No, I think that's right. And let me ask you about that, because in January, when Eurasia came out with your annual list of biggest geopolitical risks, your number one was something that we had included in our Hunting Black Swans report, but we hadn't made number one and weren't nearly as prescient as you proved to be. You called before the pandemic, before the recession, you said the biggest geopolitical risk is a contested outcome in an American election, which you pretty much nailed. Obviously, you didn't see the pandemic coming, no disrespect, but what led you guys, even before craziness, when in January, all of us smart election watchers said, yeah, president's kind of cruising. I mean, he's got a lot of people who don't like him for the things he says and tweets and does, but the economy was so hot, and you seemed to think that we were at somewhere between 48 and 52% of the country was going to think they got robbed before, and now that's right what it's looking like.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't clear that the group that was going to think it was robbed was going to be the Trump supporters. It could have been the Biden supporters, and we're still not 100% sure of that. Obviously, events in the last 6 months have conspired against Trump, and he hasn't helped himself. But leaving that aside, we knew about the impeachment, right? And here you have a sitting president that used the office of the presidency to work to pressure the Ukrainian president to open an investigation against his erstwhile political rival, the one he was most concerned about on the Democratic stage. That's, fairly obviously impeachable. He was impeached. I say this not as a Democrat or a Republican. I don't have a party affiliation, but it's obvious. But it was also clear that no Republicans were going to support that, right? Romney did. That was a surprise in terms of conviction. But leaving that aside, it was a party vote. There's a lesson that comes from that. There's a lesson that comes from the Mueller report. The lesson is that this is a White House that would never consider saying we couldn't do that. That would be wrong. That is not something one hears inside the White House or with President Trump. And so to the extent that there is a constraint, that constraint must come from others. And it's pretty clear, given the erosion of political institutions in the US, that in election time, that was going to be hard to do. So anything remotely close is going to appear to be rigged. Remember, Trump said that 2016 was rigged. He just didn't happen to be president. Well, this time he's president. And being able to use the power of the presidency when rule of law does not matter to you, I think matters. When we know that he can pardon himself or he could step down and Pence can pardon him, but you still are going to have all of these unpardonable state offenses alleged that will run up against him. This makes me feel, the way, not the United States historically, but presidents like Erdogan that feel like if they don't win, they're going to end up having to leave the country or in jail. And that kind of sensibility gets sitting executives to act in very different ways. So you put all of it together. I started Eurasia Group in 1998. We had never considered a U.S. domestic risk to be the top risk at the beginning of the year before this year. And I think it was, a combination of just how polarized the nature of the executive, the nature of the legislature, the nature of media and social media on both sides of the spectrum, what happened with the Russians and other external intervention in 2016 that Obama did not respond effectively to at all. All of those things were going to get worse. Then add the pandemic on top of it, Bruce, which of course none of us knew was coming, has obviously made the weaponization of this risk a lot more likely.
So this election will happen. Hopefully we'll have an answer. I think we will. And we enter 2021, with the world still dealing with the pandemic, so many economies coming out of pretty rough recessions, an environment you have described in books and otherwise as G0, which I'd love you to have you explain. But as part of that, also explain how you think, if it's President Trump term 2, is it 4 more years like the last 4, or do you see things meaningfully changing? He's had some geopolitical accomplishments that you've actually given him credit for, and or if it's a President Biden who says he's much more eager to bring allies on sides, to stop fighting Canada over aluminum or over milk, and to stop fighting Germany over cars. But the Boeing Airbus predates Donald Trump. That's a tough fight, and I don't think the American president changes, some of that competition. So how do you see, once we've gotten through the point of deciding who our next president is, how do you see geopolitics changing?
Yeah, I mean, my discussion of a G0 also predates Trump by quite some time. It's about 10 years ago that I said a G0 was coming, not a G7, not a G20, but an environment geopolitically where there's an absence of global leadership. There's a lot of leadership, but none of it's global. And the institutions are increasingly misaligned with the balance of power. And, for me, this is a cyclical issue. You create institutions, they are aligned with the powers that exist at that period of time. The power balance changes, it evolves, but the institutions are sticky. I mean, Trump, when he was running for office, said that NATO was not outdated. He said that was worse than that. He said it was not irrelevant. He said it was something like that. It was broken, fundamentally broken. I mean, if you look at NATO, if you were going to create a national security alliance for the United States today, it wouldn't look like NATO. It wouldn't be focused on Russia in decline. It'd be focused on China. Russia would be relevant at the margins, don't get me wrong. But I mean, Japan would be a member, South Korea, Australia would be a member, right? Turkey would not be a member. But, you can say that NATO is outdated, but you're not going to create anything new because the political lift on that would be too difficult. So, in the same way that you have economic recessions on average every 7 years, you have boom and bust cycles, you have geopolitical boom and bust cycles too. They're just much longer, so we don't reflect on them as such. But it was pretty clear that we were heading into a geopolitical bust cycle. That's the G0. Trump is symptomatic of that in the United States, but he has not been a driver of that. He's accelerated those trends to a degree. I say all of that because it's very clear that a Biden administration, especially if the Dems take the Senate, will be a dramatic departure in domestic and economic policy from Trump. Think about regulatory policy, think about taxation, think about social policy, immigration, all of that. On foreign policy, not only are presidents historically more constrained, but actually Trump and Biden think more alike in many ways than folks would believe. I mean, on China, they generally agree on almost all of the policy orientations that we've seen on the Uyghurs, on Hong Kong, on Taiwan, on South China Sea, on trade, on technology. I can go on and on and on. Now, clearly, Biden would articulate that in different ways. The bureaucratic and diplomatic engagement would be much more robust and aligned. There'd be more multilateral coordination with American allies that are like-minded on these issues, sure. But overall, I don't think they look all that different on policy. On the Middle East, Biden would try to get back into the JCPOA, but let the nuclear deal. But let's remember, everybody, that deal took a long time, and it wasn't, I mean, it was a breakthrough, but only at the margins. It didn't get rid of all US sanctions. It didn't stop the Iranians from sending money to organizations we consider to be terrorists. Didn't stop them from ballistic missile testing. I mean, all these things. And let's also keep in mind that the biggest immediate give was that Iranian money from the old regime was unfrozen. They now have that money. So that incentive is gone. Plus, they've got their own elections coming up in late 2021, I think it is. So, I mean, for all of those reasons, I don't think that they are immediately going to simply rejoin the same deal that had been on offer to them before. While when you look at US-Israel policy, you look at the Abraham Accords, the breakthrough relations with the UAE, with Bahrain, with others coming down the pike, again, Biden would support all of those things. The new NAFTA, Biden has said publicly that he supports. The biggest difference between Biden and Trump, I would say twofold. First would be the willingness to rejoin and not leave multilateral organizations that Trump has basically thrown under the bus, the World Health Organization, as well as COVAX. I do believe that Biden would immediately embrace those. The Paris Climate Accord, which we would leave after the election if Trump wins. We will not if Biden does. There are other things like that in the UN architecture and the rest. So even here, Trump is overstated. I mean, Trump has been easily as strong a partner to the IMF as Obama was. Now, some of that is behind the scenes effective diplomacy between Christine Lagarde and Ivanka in the early days. And anyone that says that Ivanka accomplishes nothing does not understand that IMF conversation. It was relevant. But since then, Mnuchin with Lagarde and now with Georgieva, it's actually worked really well at a time when the IMF desperately needed a balanced and even relationship with the United States. They put an enormous amount of money on the table for a lot of countries in the past months. That's one example. I can give you many more. So I think that the polarization inside the United States means not giving Trump credit for anything if you are a never Trump person. And that is obviously deeply problematic if you just want to analyze what the hell is going on and how different Biden will be. The other place that Biden would be very different is on Europe. And, even multilateralists have a hard time thinking about Brussels as a strong actor. They still primarily are focusing on Berlin and Paris and the rest. I'm not sure Biden would be immune from that, but certainly his orientation on big tech, his orientation on the climate and environment policy, his orientation on redistribution of wealth feels all more social democratic, feels all more closely aligned with the regulatory superpowers that the Europeans writ large flex and use. And, Trump's most damaged personal relations with American allies have been with Merkel and Macron. Those relations would be far better. Under Biden, Trump has been in favor of Brexit, has supported the Eurosceptics like Orban in Hungary. Biden assuredly would not do that. So for a short period of time, I think that every meeting with the Europeans would just be a relief that Biden didn't throw up all over them. But let's keep in mind that, if you have a major heart condition and you have a cardiologist that does not care about you, is completely unempathetic, and suddenly you get a really great cardiologist, your meetings are going to feel much better. But you still have a serious heart condition. And in 6 months, in 1 year's time, the structural challenges that a lot of these countries have with the United States that is much more powerful than they are and is not very interested in carrying the same water that the Americans have historically, those things don't go away. And so again, I would caution that I think the G0 is the more important structural condition, not 4 or even 8 years of Trump.
So that's very helpful. It's a great analogy, though I wish you weren't using that analogy with the two oldest candidates for president in American history. It feels dangerously close. But you've touched on multiple times now on China and U.S. China, and it's everything I've read and everything I believe, and certainly the things I've read from you make me think that to understand the world, geopolitics for the next decade or two, it's very much about the U.S.-China relationship. It's whether, per Graham Allison, we're destined for war because the rising power is meeting the established power, whether Henry Kissinger is right, we're in the foothills of a new Cold War, which is certainly better than a hot war, or whether maybe there is a way to accommodate China without the U.S. losing, surrendering, or having to go to guns. What's your take on how you think the U.S.-China relationship is likely to play out both in 2021, which is the immediate, but also what are the paths that might lead to a non-horrible outcome?
Well, I'm worried, but I'm certainly more balanced than either Graham Allison or Dr. Kissinger. And I've talked with both a lot about these issues. We just disagree. I think that the strength of entrenched interests in the United States and China to maintain strong interdependence in areas where they make a lot of money is really heavy. Even Trump, who is willing to say and tweet things that no other sentient human being would do, when it came down to TikTok, was willing to sort of throw his strategic concerns out the window because Oracle, with a management team that's given a lot of money to Trump, said, hey, we've got a good deal. And, you know, I think that, like, if you go talk to the NBA leadership, they think that the future of the league, their merchandising, their fan base, even their talent base is in China. And I think in 5 and 10 years' time, they're still going to think that. If you go to a Walmart today, most of the goods you're going to buy are going to be made in China. I think in 5 years' time, that will still be true. I think if you go to a mid-tier US college or university, most of the full price, full tuition bearing international students come from China. I think that will still be true. I think there are very, very strong interests in many sectors of the US and Chinese economy that will strongly resist a Cold War. Never mind a hot war. I mean, I think a hot war is an insane concept just because China is not a superpower. They're a technology superpower. To some degrees, they are becoming an economic superpower, but they're not a military superpower, and they're not close. The United States outspends the next 7 countries in the world militarily combined, and the Chinese are a regional military power. That matters. They're not even trying to really build out their nuclear capabilities. They see the Russians did that. They think it was a waste of money. They're expressing their influence and their power in very different ways. Now, in 10 or 20 years, if the Americans and the Chinese are at the cusp of major quantum computing breakthroughs, and one of those breakthroughs would completely undermine the national security and cryptographic capacities of the other, I think that could create the logic for preemption on the part of the other that could be very dangerous indeed. But that is not what Graham Allison is talking about. That's not what Kissinger is talking about. So no, for the foreseeable future, the level of interdependence between the US and China will be robust. And that precludes conversations of Cold War, even Neil Ferguson. I think a lot of this is because it's sexy. It drives eyeballs in conversation. It's not people that are really thinking about where the two economies are going or have really spent time with people that have really deep pockets and interests in maintaining that. Now, the place where I am, it is, first of all, Bruce, it is clearly true that in almost every aspect of US-China relations right now, we are heading to a more confrontational, less cooperative posture. That is certainly true. And that would not change radically if Biden were to become president. It doesn't mitigate the things I just talked about, but it just means that it's going to be harder for us to maintain the same level of interdependence, that there will be greater costs, greater inefficiencies. You know, the tariff environment we presently have, which I think Biden would have a hard time suddenly undoing, for example. The red lines on state capitalism and intellectual property, which the Chinese are going to have a hard time suddenly integrating with the US. But the place where I think we really have seen a sea change is in technology. And 10 years ago, when we talked about technology, we talked about the World Wide Web. Today, if we're not talking about the splinter net, we should be. And you have, Bruce, and I've seen your slides about this. You know, the Chinese have not allowed American firms, dominant American firms like Google and Amazon, access to the most important data market in the world. That should antagonize us. That's a problem for us. And instead, they have created national champions, not only in tech, but also in fintech. So yes, Huawei, but yes, and financial too. And clearly this is becoming zero sum. So if we think about 5G and the future of the Internet of Things, and Huawei, which is the closest thing the Chinese have to a national technology champion, I think that the Americans are correct to say that if the Chinese do not dramatically change their behaviors, that we are not prepared to allow them access to the US market. And indeed, we're going to use our leverage to help ensure that our allies use Western companies as well. Now, the question is, and there are many problems that come out of this, this is a fairly narrow wedge into globalization. That wedge is going to expand over time because we're not just talking about you know, our smartphones, we're talking about the entire ecosystem of data around us as information consumers, as consumers in the global economy. That will change behaviors. It will create more tribalism between those attached to U.S. as opposed to a Chinese system. It will also decouple significant aspects of the global economy that right now seem to be working pretty well. I mean, think about the future of autonomous driving. Think about the future of smart infrastructures in cities. So I think that it is really incumbent on the next president, either Trump or Biden, to complexify the tech conversation so that anytime you talk about AI, it isn't an equivalent national security red line. There are some areas that we shouldn't work with them and we should be fighting. There are others where we actively should. And there are some that are actually to play for, depending on how the Americans, the Chinese, and other parties behave. Right now, it's become very black or white. There's very little gray in artificial intelligence right now.
So if you were advising the next president, which undoubtedly you will be, or at least if it's President Biden, what's your recommendation? How to play the U.S.-China relationship? It's because you mentioned you think there is general alignment, say, on the Uyghurs. I don't know. I didn't read John Bolton's book. He claims it wasn't a priority for the president until the president was looking for reasons to punch China, whereas I think it'll be very much a front and center issue for President Biden, and frankly, one that makes it really difficult to find too much cooperation on too many other things. I mean, you could see that as the tip of the spear leading to almost how ultimately we dealt with apartheid. I mean, how do you negotiate even on climate or other things if there are concentration camps?
Oh, believe me, the Biden administration will have no problem negotiating on climate, despite the fact that there are concentration camps in China. I certainly agree. I did not read John Bolton's book. I feel like a better human being. I accept that Trump does not first turn to human rights when he thinks about diplomatic issues. But again, I'm not thinking about what's inside Trump's head. I'm thinking about what the policies are. And the number of sanctions that have been placed against individuals as well as companies that have been involved in providing surveillance technology and otherwise engaged in the systematic repression of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang in China. I don't think that sanction regime from the US would look all that different under a Biden administration. In the same way that Trump has certainly been very interested in various kinds of reset with President Putin in Russia. And yet the actual outcome of US policies, I mean, Trump has been thwarted at every turn by investigative journalists, by his own cabinet, by the deep bureaucracy in the United States, by people like Fiona Hill. I mean, you name it. So that's what I was saying, Bruce. I think you're right that there are differences in the orientation of these human beings. We shouldn't overstate them in terms of actual policy outcomes. And we also shouldn't overstate just how much of a moderate Biden is, how much of a foreign policy centrist Biden is. He's 77. He's not going to suddenly change his mind on things. And he has decades of people around him that want all the plum jobs, and they'll get most of them. So I just don't see a dramatic shift on that stuff. And, the two things that really struck me in the first presidential debate, one was the insanity of Trump's continued willingness to shoot himself in the foot and not allow Biden to make mistakes. But the second was Biden continuing to just really push away from anything that smelled like Sanders and Warren, right? Like, I am not in favor of the Green New Deal. I do not want to defund the police. I mean, all of this stuff, fracking, I'm not in favor of a ban on fracking. And I mean, if that's what he's doing when he needs these people in the run up to the election, you think he's going to act in a more solicitous way once he's already president and all of his people are gnashing their teeth for jobs and money? There's no way. So I'm not that worked up over that.
So you'd referenced the splinter net, and this is certainly a year when put front and center for all of us are failures to prepare for foreseeable risks, the pandemic being a big one, the lack of adequate health insurance for 36 million Americans, leading to a lot more folks with pre-existing conditions, the lack of social safety nets in terms of, half of American families had no emergency savings. As I hope we may, as a nation, start focusing on what you might call the resilience economy or investments in preparedness. One area I worry a lot about is cyber, because for all of the desired and hoped cooperations, the area of maybe the most active aggression between the US and China has been and remains hacking. Particularly they're hacking us, although I would imagine there are offensive things we're doing I'm just not aware of. I remember what, early Bush, we sold them an airplane with like literally an unlimited number of listening devices baked into it, which I remember the news, it crashed. So they pulled it apart. But I still worry that the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of the 21st century is a hack that goes wrong and that, turns off a dam or otherwise causes damage. Do you think that's an area of potential cooperation, or is that on the other side of red lines?
I'd like it to be an area of cooperation. I'm not sure how we get from here to there. There's no trust between the US and the Chinese, the US and the Russian governments, the US and the Iranian governments on pretty much any issue, but most assuredly on that one. I certainly remember the Russian cyber attacks on Ukraine that probably took 1 to 2 points of GDP off that economy, but also expanded well beyond Ukraine. And as a consequence, shut down one of the largest shipping companies in the world for a couple of weeks, had major impact on FedEx Europe, for example, others. The Russians either didn't know that could happen, didn't care, or both. But when that kind of thing happens and they're just attacking Ukraine, you realize that asymmetrical cyber capacity to disrupt is a lot greater than we usually think about on a day-to-day basis. And, to put that in the context of this pandemic, let's say that this pandemic ultimately is a 10% hit. So as we get to the end of 2021, you look at opportunity cost and economic damage, we end up in a 10% worse condition economically in the world than we would have been if there had not been any coronavirus. That feels like roughly the hit. And that's pretty rough, 10% off of global GDP. But the good thing about the pandemic is it really hit all of the non-innovative sectors of the economy, right? You're hitting fossil fuels, you're hitting, brick and mortar, you're hitting, go to retail, but the most innovative sectors and the tech firms and the fintech firms are doing absolutely the best. They're killing it. And that's a really good thing. Like if you have to redistribute bits of the economy, you want it redistributing towards the bits of the economy that are going to be responsible for the biggest solutions in the 21st century. Now, Bruce, if this had not been a coronavirus and instead same scale of impact, 10% of the global economy, but it had been a massive cyber attack, so Ukraine times 100. And so instead of hitting the real economy, it hit our virtual selves, our data, it hit our banks, it hit, Zoom and Facebook and Google. I would be so much more pessimistic about, maybe when you asked me at the beginning of the call, what am I optimistic about? Maybe it's the fact that this was a coronavirus pandemic as opposed to cyber. Maybe it's that. Because, one of the biggest problems we have in the world today is that entrenched sclerotic interests have too much power and prevent the world from moving in the direction it needs to move to allow the average human being to feel like the system is not rigged against them. And coronavirus does have the long-term potential to create a lot more wealth that, yes, could disenfranchise a lot more people, but also could actually destroy a lot of the entrenched interests that have prevented economies and political systems from moving forward. And I think that's a good thing. Look, I was delighted a few hours ago to see that Pope Francis is finally slowly moving the Catholic Church into the 21st century by saying that he would support civil unions that are same sex. I'm a Catholic. No one believes that the Catholic Church is close to 2020, right? In a lot of ways, it's stuck a century ago. I kind of think we need, internal crises that force institutions that are really sclerotic to become more forward-leaning. That's the only way you really get solutions. And in some ways, even though the pandemic isn't big enough to do that, it is actually hitting the right areas to do that. And I think that's interesting.
I agree with that. And I also think it may not be big enough alone, but pre-pandemic and even pre-Trump, the reason we were seeing change elections, the reason we were seeing populists running and winning in Brazil or Mexico or UK or the United States, I think, is because the policies and the institutions of last century weren't making people feel protected against the realities of this century.
Yeah.
We all felt fragile. And the pandemic, the recession, the social injustice in the streets, all bring that much more attention to the need to bring last century's institutions into the modern world. I agree with you. Let me ask you, I've got two more questions for you, Ian, and then I'll turn to both the chat line, and I've had a few folks send me questions ahead. We promise we'll have everybody out in time for lunch, or maybe you're eating lunch. If you are, turn your camera off, please, including relatives of mine. First, your advice to multinational CEOs. They're in a G0. You called this a while back. We're looking, I do believe, for the reasons we just described, this next decade, the roaring 2020s, as in the Gilded Age, are going to see a lot of major policy change and meaningful efforts to modernize the institutions and the policies, so they're no longer, just like you pointed out, NATO. NATO was brilliantly designed, purpose-built to contain Soviet tanks, which aren't really such a thing, though they are a little thing, but they're not Soviet anyway. How do you advise CEOs who are now feeling like they've got so many more geopolitical risks?
Less time for box checking. I mean, look, if you're a CEO that is in one of the sectors that is really being hit by this pandemic, it's not geopolitical advice you need right now. You realize that you can talk about Black Lives Matter, you can talk about global climate, you can talk about a vaccine, but I mean, you're already one of the most overworked people in the world, and you are doing everything possible just to still have an organization in a year or 2 years' time. So for all of the people out there that are saying CEOs in the private sector are going to be a big part of the solution, actually, a lot of the CEOs are struggling to survive their institutions in the next 2 years. This year has been pretty good for the economy because, with the exception of Mexico, most of the big global economies have responded very well to the coronavirus crisis. Healthcare is a very different story. Next year is going to be a lot harder, right? I just think that you can't generalize. But if you're a CEO that is in a sweet spot right now, that is taking advantage of the knowledge economy, that actually has the ability to have your people work from anywhere, that can truly be global, that can really ride and drive greater efficiencies, including greater labor efficiencies, greater big data efficiencies. Those are the people that need to be thinking about what a global hybrid economy is going to mean. We're not going to live in a global free market in the next 10 years. We're going to have a system where the largest economy is a state capitalist one. The second largest economy is free market, but with some very important strategic sectors. And where increasingly corporate leaders are going to be asked to be patriotic because so many people at home are not doing so well. And that changes how you think about supply chain. It changes how you think about corporate governance, about what a global footprint looks like, about what your branding strategy is, all of those things. And so, this is the time, when everybody is actually, they've got the time, they're not on planes, they're minting money. How are you going to prep for that next global order that comes out of G0? That's really hard, but it's enormously opportune. And if you can be the first major company in your sector that gets that right, you can actually set the agenda for others, as opposed to having the biggest problem I have with the United States right now is that we know that there's going to be a post G0 order, and we should be doing more to set the tone. I don't like the fact that the Europeans, even though they have virtually no game-changing companies, their regulatory system is doing more to set rules in new spaces that we are going to be impacted about for decades. I want the Americans, as the largest economy in the world, to do more to set the norms that we don't get to occupy by ourselves, and the space will be more constrained and more competitive. But we want to make sure that whatever that new table is, the largest seat is reserved for us. We're not doing that right now. And that means that as we eventually get to that in 10 and 20 years' time, a lot of decisions are made, decisions we're not going to like as much. So I think that the CEOs that have the luxury of doing that in their own smaller spaces should be doing that. And by the way, I think Jeff Bezos at Amazon is doing that. I think he is setting himself up to be the Lockheed of the mid-21st century, to be the most important, strategically indispensable American company out there. And by the way, some of that is awesome. Some of that is deeply dystopian, but I think he has a long plan for that. I think that, and I think I think Apple is not remotely doing that right now. And I think that's important.
All right, my last question, then we've got some interesting ones that I'll move to you, maybe a little more lightning roundy. But you got a new book. That's why you're out there writing and thinking. We appreciate your taking an hour out of putting words down to spend with us. What's the new book about?
The book's called The Crisis We Need, and we're talking about some of that today with you. It is certainly a big part of why coronavirus is not it. I mean, I think it'll come out just as vaccines are starting to allow us to turn the corner on all of this. And so I think it'll help us to understand why the biggest crisis of my lifetime was not more of an opportunity, and what the coming crises like climate and others represent in terms of helping to address these big endemic structural issues.
I look forward to the book and to the audiobook and to the movie version. So some interesting questions. My friend Ashley in New York was asking about the Erdogan regime and how the Europeans may respond. Somebody else had asked about Turkey and Greece. And then there was also the hotspot question, India, China. Now, I don't want to make you go apples, oranges, and Ferraris, but I'd love your take both, on a NATO nation buying Soviet or buying Russian missiles, and not quite on the brink of war, but not looking so great these days in the region, and then also the India-China hostilities, the first gunshots in the Himalayas in decades, and maybe that creates a strategic opportunity for us, or maybe that's the thing that catches on fire that brings the whole world in.
I mean, India, China, it certainly helps that India knows how outgunned they are. So the Indians have not retaliated with military escalation in a meaningful way. They've instead retaliated by blocking TikTok, the fastest growing app in Indian history, as well as about 100+ other Chinese apps, which is supportive of Hindu nationalism and that sector. It doesn't make me think that India, China are on the brink of war. And there's been a lot of high-level engagement bilaterally between the two countries that has also helped to keep the temperature comparatively low on what otherwise could be a dicier problem. I saw someone asked about the Quad. Do I think that the United States would play a significant role? I think the Quad's meaningful and has been in advance because Modi is geopolitically much more interested in aligning with the US, especially because Pakistan is deeply in China's pocket and US-Pakistan relations have fallen apart. But that's different from the Americans in any way really intervening in that conflict. On Turkey, the Eastern Mediterranean, and now has escalated a few times. This is first of all, Cyprus was so close to unification, and they just couldn't get it over the goal line. And now with Cyprus, with Northern Cyprus elections, we just saw it's done, it's broken, it's not going to happen. It's so sad. It is so sad. And the big story around Turkey, whether it's Northern Syria or Libya or the Eastern Med, or whether it's Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia, Azerbaijan, is that Erdogan is experiencing a disastrous economy, a poor coronavirus response, a currency in free fall, a lot of capital flight. His popularity has diminished, and he's looking to stoke nationalism in the region and more broadly. He's not looking for another fight with the Russians. And in the Eastern Med thing has worked better because the United States has not said much. Pompeo was in Greece recently. He pushed back a little bit. There've been some statements, but generally speaking, we haven't been willing to really say we're going to sanction the Turks if you guys don't back down off of Greece. While the Europeans have also, they're not happy, but there are millions of refugees in Turkey. And the Europeans are providing some money to keep them there, and they don't want the floodgates open. So Turkey's been able to take advantage of differences within an EU that needs to be unanimous in order to put sanctions on. And any individual country can stop those sanctions from happening. And that has occurred. On the case of Azerbaijan, Armenia, once the Russians started engaging directly, and let's keep in mind, they're less happy with the Armenians than they have been historically because Armenia itself had a sort of a colored revolution, and they have a strongly, non-kleptocratic, democratically elected prime minister who the Russians aren't as happy with as they were the old regime. But now that the Russians have intervened, they've had tripartite roundtable. They've gotten a couple ceasefires that have fallen apart. They've not given the Turks a primary seat at the table. The Turkish response was to start testing those S-400s, the missile system, which I have to read as a signal to the Russians, hey, we just want to let you know, we're still working with you. Like there's a problem in the region, but we don't want military escalation with the Russians. And that means that I think the idea that there's going to be an all-out war between Armenia and Azerbaijan is actually quite low, is quite constrained. The Azeris just can't do that without overt, explicit Turkish support. So that's probably more than you needed, but that's just a few bips on what's happening.
No, I appreciate anything that's not we're about to see a war. All right, 2 questions left, then we'll let you out with hopefully a minute to spare before the hour. There are certainly trends towards data and infrastructure sovereignty. That's part of a splinter net where whether it's a President Trump or a President Biden, the EU is looking to have their own cloud. And nations, if data is the new oil, then having data sovereignty is perceived as the commanding heights of the 21st century economies. How do you see that trend unfolding?
I don't think the Europeans are ultimately going to be able to ride herd on all of these outcomes because the companies are overwhelmingly American. And that will continue to be the case. If anything, that has been extended because of coronavirus and because of the European response to coronavirus. So all the optimism at the beginning, but it's something that Macron has talked about, creating AI champions, the amount of money he's willing to spend, the regulatory challenges of getting companies set up, of hiring people in France. My God, that's just not going to happen. And so, yeah, I accept that there are different views on privacy and data localization in Europe. And certainly there's going to be a lot of tax shakedowns of big tech companies inside Europe. And Margrethe Vestager is going to take the lead on that very effectively. She's a strong policymaker and bureaucrat. But that's very different from saying that the Europeans are going to reflect a third way on data. I don't believe that at all. Increasingly, that's going to be a technology Cold War, and the Europeans are going to be very decidedly on the American side.
It's good to hear. All right, final question. James Carville famously in '92 said, "It's the economy, stupid," is what he wrote on the wall. And we just saw Prime Minister Ardern in New Zealand crush, total landslide victory, and she has famously been brilliant. Admittedly, they're an island and they're kind of remote, but at the same time, she's done a great job. Are you seeing, and do you expect to see over the next year to 18 months, the leaders that handled the pandemic well are going to be the ones who get reelected and stay in power, and the ones who flubbed it are going to be the ones who are voted out or whose terms are not extended?
I think timing matters. South Korea, that was a huge win for President Park because it came right as he was doing a great job. Again, New Zealand, same. You're seeing like all this second wave talk, and they've been able to crush the virus twice. But in Brazil, Bolsonaro mishandled coronavirus about as badly as any leader in the world, and he has right now bounced to the highest ratings of his presidency on the back of a decent amount of money being given to a lot of Brazilians, some movement on economic reform still happening in Congress, and the fact that the virus, the worst of the virus, at least for now, seems to have passed in Brazil, where in the United States, we're entering into this very significant second wave, and Trump himself with a White House super spreader event a month before the elections. The timing couldn't be worse for Trump. So I think if this election were in 6 months' time in the United States, we might be having a very different conversation. I mean, Trump continues to perform as well, if not a little better than Biden on how do you think about the economy? How's the economy doing? But on coronavirus, of course, he's way underwater. And most Americans right now, appropriately in my view, think that coronavirus is the most important election issue compared to the economy. In 6 months' time, that view could change. That view could change significantly. So, Bruce, I'm not sure that I'd say this is going to have long legs to it, even though the impact of coronavirus itself on the global economy certainly will.
Ian Bremmer, thank you for taking an hour with several hundred folks who hang on your every word and enjoy what you're writing, and keep up the great work.
My pleasure, man. Good to be with you. Take it easy.
See you.
Yeah.